Robin Hood was from Sherwood Forest near Nottingham, right? Well, what if I told you he was probably actually from Yorkshire? Hi, I'm Juliet, I'm a history lecturer. On this channel I talk about myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, witchcraft and weird and wonderful history in general. And today, why Robin Hood was probably from Yorkshire. Most modern retellings of the story of Robin Hood will agree on a few central elements. He lived in Sherwood Forest as an outlaw during the reign of King Richard I and was active particularly in 1193, when King Richard was kidnapped on his way back from the Third Crusade and he was held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor, and his younger brother Prince John rebelled and conspired with the King of France to overthrow Richard's throne and even tried to pay the Holy Roman Emperor to keep him longer. Unfortunately for John, their mother Eleanor of Aquitaine raised the money to pay the ransom to get Richard freed. But between Eleanor raising money from the people to pay the ransom and John taking money from the people to pay to have him kept kidnapped for longer, the people of England ended up with a heck of a lot of taxes to pay. That history of John, Richard and Eleanor is true, but whether Robin Hood was active at that time, and especially in that place, is much less certain. There are a few other core elements of the Robin Hood story you might be expecting to hear about that you actually won't be hearing about at all in this video, because I am going to look at the earliest sources for Robin Hood and where they suggest he might have been from and when he might have lived. So I'm not paying any attention at all to things that don't show up until later sources. That means no Maid Marian in this video. In the earliest sources, Robin is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, which is not surprising because the country is Catholic at that time, and obviously the Virgin Mary is a very important figure in the Roman Catholic Church. Maid Marian as a character does have medieval roots. She was imported from a poem written in France, in French, about 1283 called Robin et Marion, which was about a French man called Robin, but nothing to do with Robin Hood, and a woman called Marian. Both Robin Hood and Marian were then brought into the May Games, where people would play act as these figures from legend and folklore. And then at some point in the 16th century, the two of them were put together and became Robin Hood and Maid Marian as we know them. There's also not much stealing from the rich to give to the poor. In these early sources, Robin is quite particular about who he steals from, but it's not to do with whether the victim is poor or rich. It's much more to do with how honest they are. The outlaws will waylay somebody and ask how much money they're carrying, and if they answer honestly, they will likely be able to keep it, or maybe asked for a small fee for the dinner that Robin and his men will make them come to, and allowed to keep the rest. But if they lie, then they will steal the money that the person pretended not to have. But it's not a straightforward case of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, not yet. Richard the Lionheart and John also play no part in those early tales, so we will come back to whether or not Robin might have been alive during that time at all a bit later on. The earliest retellings of the story of Robin Hood are all poems, and we do have a few that are actually medieval. In British history, we usually end the medieval period with the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 and the accession of Henry VII, Henry Tudor, to the English throne, which marks the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. And because that is roughly around the same period as things like Martin Luther and the Renaissance and the discovery of America in 1492, that's where we end medieval history. And we do have some sources for Robin Hood that are from the medieval period, and those are the ones I'm going to focus on today. We have the poem Robin Hood and the Monk from a manuscript written about 1450. The one that I will be talking about most is called A Gest of Robin Hood, or sometimes A Little Gest of Robin Hood. This has a complete text from the printer Wynkyn de Worde, who was working between 1492 and 1534, so it comes from somewhere between those dates. We also have half the poem in a printing from around 1510 to 1515, and then 3 other complete later copies. So this is really the most important source for the early stories of Robin Hood. It is by far the most complete, and it's almost the oldest as well. We also have 3 poems from the Percy Folio written around the mid-1500s, Robin Hood, His Death, Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, and Robin Hood and the Curtal Friar, although Robin Hood and the Curtal Friar has much less archaic language and is probably actually a bit later than the other 2. There's also a fragment of a play from 1475 that covers a lot of the same material as the Guy of Gisborne poem. You will have noticed, of course, that the only one of those that fits my definition of medieval is Robin Hood and the Monk from about 1450, but these are all based on oral traditions. These are all stories that have been told and retold and passed down orally for a long time before reaching written written form. So basically, Robin Hood and the Monk is solidly medieval, and A Gest of Robin Hood is very, very close to medieval. It's just squeaking into the 16th century, but we can assume that the content of that poem is, broadly speaking, medieval as well. The figure of Robin Hood, as presented in The Gest of Robin Hood, is largely familiar, but there are some differences between him and the Robin we have come to know and love through film and TV and literature and all sorts of things over the past few hundred years. The most important difference is he is definitely a yeoman. A yeoman is a particular class of medieval society. According to Ian Mortimer in the Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, yeomen and franklins are merchants with less than £500 capital. The class includes some professionals, including physicians, lawyers, master masons and master carpenters. So they are a higher social class and have more money than freemen or husbandmen, shopkeepers and workers, and they are certainly higher in society than unfree villeins and labourers, but they are below esquires and gentlemen who have land and money, and very much below knights. And the Gest very specifically states, "Stop and listen, everyone that comes of freeborn blood." So specifically people who are not serfs, nor indeed slaves. There would have been a very small number of slaves in medieval England. Mostly we're talking serfs or free. "I'll tell you of a good yeoman, his name was Robin Hood. He lives in the greenwood around Barnesdale." Barnesdale is an area of South Yorkshire, so it doesn't correspond to an exact town or village. It is a slightly more general area, but it is very distinctly located in South Yorkshire. The Gest tells us, "Robin stood in Barnesdale and leaned against a tree, and beside him there stood Little John. A good yeoman was he." So the entire band are basically yeomen. Much the miller's son is probably a level below, the class below yeoman, but Robin and Little John are specifically identified as yeomen. And Little John is Robin Hood's most common kind of friend and ally, the merry man who comes up the most. He is his sidekick throughout these stories. But despite living in South Yorkshire, Robin's greatest enemy is still the Sheriff of Nottingham. In the Little Gest of Robin Hood, Robin tells his men who they should go beat up and rob on the highway. He tells them, "But as for bishops and archbishops, you shall them beat and bind, and the High Sheriff of Nottingham, you shall keep him in mind." So he wants them to beat up the highest members of the church clergy, not necessarily the lower ranked priests, but bishops and archbishops. The medieval church is quite notorious for being quite corrupt, and particularly wealthy bishops and archbishops and heads of abbeys and so on could be rather corrupt and very rich, and could make a lot of money through relics and pardons and all sorts of things. So it's not surprising to see a medieval poem that does not like bishops and archbishops, and then Robin lumps in randomly the Sheriff of Nottingham, with people that they should look out for and beat up if they come across him. He also meets a knight from Lancashire. The knight is unnamed until quite far on into the poem, when he is revealed to be Sir Richard of the Lee, and Lee is miles away from either Yorkshire or Nottingham, on the other side of the country in Lancashire, and he has a woman who is his close kin, who is the prioress of Kirklees Abbey, which is about 20 miles west of Barnesdale. So again, that is a South Yorkshire location. He's also loyal to the king, who is in London, not Jerusalem or Austria, London, and is called Edward. Not Richard, not John, not even Henry. The poem says, "You'll come to me to the greenwood without any lying, until such time as I get us grace from Edward our comely king." Robin's closest companions are, as noted, Little John, Much the miller's son, and Scarlock, who is presumably the a kind of older name for Will Scarlet. And although they are supposed to beat up bishops, archbishops and the Sheriff of Nottingham, he is very specific that they must not do harm to women, and that is very clearly stated in the Gest, nor should they harm good yeomen. The Gest says, "Robin so loved our dear lady," that's the Virgin Mary, "that for fear of deadly sin, he would never harm the company that any woman was in." So he won't even attack a group that includes women, and certainly won't harm women. And he tells his men, "We shall do well, I vow, if we never harm the husbandman that labours with his plough, neither shall you harm the good yeoman that walks by Greenwood's end, nor any knight nor any squire that would be a good friend." So again, it's not really so much to do with social class as it is to do with how good a person they are. So there isn't really any specific stealing from the rich to give to the poor, although the end of the Gest of Robin Hood, after relating his death, does note that he did poor people good. As you may have already noticed from some of that summarising, the geography of these poems is all over the place. Robin Hood and the Monk, the earliest, is set in Sherwood, but Robin Hood and the Potter has Little John meet the Potter in Wentbridge, which is near Barnesdale in Yorkshire, but then Robin disguises himself as the Potter for the Sheriff of Nottingham, who is still his prime enemy. Robin Hood, his death takes place at Kirklees Abbey, where he goes to his close relative, the prioress, but she, under the influence of her lover, bleeds him to death instead, treacherously. Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne features the Sheriff of Nottingham capturing Little John in Barnesdale, Yorkshire, although Gisborne, the place that Guy is of, is in Lancashire. Robin Hood and the Curtal Friar has him go to find the Curtal Friar at Fountains Dale in Sherwood, and the Gest, which is by far the longest, has Robin and especially Little John flitting between Barnesdale and Sherwood as if they had a Star Trek-style transporter pad. The Gest also features Robin telling his men to go to Watling Street. Now, actual Roman Watling Street is the road from London to Wroxeter, which is now the A5. They don't mean that Watling Street, which is nowhere near anywhere that these poems mention. But at the time, there were some roads in South Yorkshire that had gained the name Watling Street, even though they weren't the actual Roman Watling Street. So they're almost certainly referring to that Watling Street, another Yorkshire location. There was also a good road link between Sherwood and Barnesdale, so considering they are going to the highway, they're basically highwaymen without the horses, they're going to the road to waylay travellers. So they could, in theory, be based in either one and be waylaying travellers travelling between Sherwood and Barnesdale, which could be an explanation for how Robin ends up with his mortal enemy being the Sheriff of Nottingham, even though he's from Barnesdale. And the Gest brings in Lancashire as well, by eventually naming its unnamed knight from the early part of the poem as Sir Richard of the Lee, which is in Lancashire. None of these poems provide much indication of a timeline at all, apart from naming the king as Edward. Later chroniclers put Robin Hood in all sorts of different places. In 1420, medieval Scottish chronicler Andrew de Winton said Robin Hood and Little John were active in the years 1283 to 85 in Inglewood and Barnesdale. That does match the reference to Edward in the Gest, because that is during the reign of Edward I, and it does match Barnesdale. That would suggest Robin not only didn't live in Sherwood Forest or particularly close to Nottingham, but that he's also nearly a century later than we usually place him now. In the 1440s, another Scotsman, Walter Bower, put the rise of the famous murderer Robin Hood, as well as Little John, together with their accomplices, in the year 1266. This would be the reign of Henry III, right after the defeat and death of the rebel Simon de Montfort in 1265. So another theory about Robin's history is that he actually belongs in the middle of the 13th century as a supporter of Simon de Montfort, who then turns to outlawry after de Montfort's death. A third Scotsman, moving into the early modern period, John Major, no relation to the former Prime Minister, writing a history of Greater Britain in 1521, said Robin Hood and Little John were active during the captivity of Richard I in 1193 to 94. And of course, that is the version that then came to be accepted as the version of the story. And that's the time setting that we're all most familiar with. Richard is the king, but he is absent. John is the prince. As we've seen, the Gest names the king as Edward, but even there it doesn't necessarily match Andrew de Winton's suggestion that it's during the reign of Edward I. Edward I reigned 1272 to 1307. He was followed by Edward II, 1307 to 1327. And the Gest also describes the King Edward making a tour around the country, including Nottingham. And the places he goes on this royal progress match the royal progress of Edward II that took place April to November 1323. That puts Robin well over a century after the period we usually place him in. That is a very late date. Because all of the surviving sources are so late, it's not impossible, although as we will see a bit later in the video, I think it's very unlikely. We will see why. The most common suggestions are that he was alive and outlawing either during the fairly long reign of Henry III during the 13th century, which is 1216 to 1272, or in the 1190s during the captivity of King Richard. A few different individuals, or hypothetical individuals, have been identified as possible real Robin Hoods. Later ballads from into the early modern period had several suggestions, including that he was the dispossessed Earl of Huntingdon, One claimed he was born in Loxley Town in Nottinghamshire, but these all appear from the 16th century onwards. So the idea that he is an aristocrat or a dispossessed aristocrat or an aristocrat avenging his father, whether that's the Earl of Loxley or the Earl of Huntington, these are all later. As we saw, the Gest of Robin Hood clearly states he is a yeoman. He is not aristocracy at all. The Earl of Huntington idea was popularised by a play written by Anthony Mundy in 1598 and made its way all the way into a 1950s film, which is available now on Disney Plus, starring Richard Green, which repeats the Earl of Huntington idea. And then a lot of other versions just latched onto Loxley and just the idea of him being some kind of dispossessed aristocrat. Medieval historian J.C. Holt argues that he is clearly not an aristocrat and thinks that the most likely candidate might be a man called Robert Hod, or Hood, who was tried by the Assizes at York in 1225. Assizes are periodic criminal courts hearing serious cases carrying the death penalty or life imprisonment. And remember, one of those chroniclers quite specifically called Robin a murderer, and in the course of these poems he definitely kills quite a few people, including the Sheriff of Nottingham. So it makes sense that he would be on trial for a capital crime. So Robert Hod was tried in 1225 and then listed as a fugitive in 1226. So that would make sense if he's an outlaw, he's committed a crime, been tried, run away, and he's living as an outlaw somewhere. Later, Robert Hod, or Hood, was given the name Hobhod, or Hobhood. And Holt suggests that he might be the source of the Robin Hood legend, although Holt also notes that there was probably more than one source for it, another point we shall come back to shortly. Thor Ewing, whose translations I have been quoting, has produced a whole genealogy and detailed timeline for his hypothetical original Robin Hood. Ewing puts his life at around 1208 to 1288, so again primarily reign of Henry III, and Ewing believes that he was an illegitimate grandson of the Earl of Huntington, going back to that Huntington link. Ewing argues, going back to the Earl of Huntington idea, that he was actually an illegitimate grandson of the Earl of Huntington. And this was a background that was claimed for Robin Hood in a 19th century Scottish ballad called Robin Hood's Birth. This much later ballad was sung for a scholar called Robert Jameson by a Mrs. Browne of Falkland in 1800, and then it was published in Jameson's ballad anthology, Popular Ballads and Songs from Tradition Manuscripts and Scarce Editions in 1806. So it dates to basically the late 18th century as an oral tradition. And Ewing takes this and uses it to create a hypothetical Robin Hood who can be made to fit a lot of aspects of the earliest stories. In Ewing's hypothetical family tree, John de Balliol, Sheriff of Nottingham from 1261 to 62, becomes Robin's brother-in-law because he's married to his half-sister, Dervaguilla. Fabulous name, that. This explains how they know each other if Robin lives in Yorkshire. Ewing also suggests that Robin was a supporter of Simon de Montfort and that would make him and de Balliol enemies politically as well. This family tree also makes Robin Hood related to Scottish kings, and Ewing suggests this explains why this story is so popular in Scotland. You'll have noticed that all three of the early chroniclers who put dates on him are Scottish, and this ballad that suggests he's an illegitimate grandson of the Earl of Huntington is also Scottish. So the suggestion is he's related to Scottish kings, and therefore a particularly strong oral tradition has survived relating to Robin Hood in Scotland. Ewing also suggests that him being illegitimate explains why he is sometimes referred to as an aristocrat and sometimes as a yeoman. Which, yeah, sort of. I mean, yeomen are not, generally speaking, the illegitimate offspring of aristocrats. Yeomen are merchants and professionals. I can see what he means, but they're not really the same thing. And the medieval sources really are quite clear that Robin is a yeoman, not a dispossessed aristocrat or a relative of an aristocrat. He's a relative of a prioress. So he has relatives with some money. But that's the only bit of evidence that really suggests that. And I don't think this theory really fits with or reflects the earliest medieval evidence, and it doesn't reflect the nature of the earliest sources, because these sources are poems. These are not archives, these are not records, they are poems, and they have been transmitted orally, and the oral tradition will change and mutate as it goes. If we have a look at the Gest of Robin Hood, which is by far the longest, it's divided into 8 fits, or chapters. Fits 1, 2 and 4 tell a relatively self-contained story about Robin in Barnesdale and a good knight who was indebted to St Mary's Abbey in York. These seem fairly firmly placed in Yorkshire. In Fit 3, in the middle of this story, Little John, who is supposed to be with the knight, then gets loaned to the Sheriff of Nottingham after an archery contest and recruits the sheriff's cook for Robin. And that story really doesn't seem to particularly fit with fits 1, 2 and 4 around it. It looks like it's kind of been shoved in there. And it takes place in Nottingham and they take place in Yorkshire. Then Fit 5 has Robin win an archery contest organised by the Sheriff of Nottingham, so back in Nottingham again. Then he is discovered and they flee to Sir Richard of the Lee, who is identified as the knight from Fits 1, 2 and 4. But there had been no prior indication of any identity for that knight other than probably someone from Yorkshire. So again, it looks like a story about Robin fleeing the Sheriff of Nottingham all the way to Lancashire has become attached to a story from Yorkshire by simply naming the knight in the Lancashire story as being the same knight as the one from the Yorkshire story. But really, there isn't much connection, other than Sir Richard of the Lee is a friend of Robin Hood, and maybe owes him a favour because he takes him in and his castle gets besieged because he's protecting Robin Hood. So making him the knight from the Yorkshire story who owes his recovery of his fortune to Robin Hood makes sense of that. But really, they're disconnected stories that take place in entirely different places. Fit 6 covers further misadventures with the Sheriff of Nottingham, ending in the death of the Sheriff. Fit 7 has Robin pardoned by the King for killing his deer. He has been hunting the King's deer in the Royal Forest of Sherwood. So that has more of a Sherwood connection. Obviously the King is in London but then travels to Nottingham. And then Fit 8 covers Robin's death at Kirklees, back in Yorkshire again. Basically, the author of the Gest has worked really hard to pull together what seems pretty clearly to be a series of disconnected stories. There's a story about Robin Hood and the Knight in Yorkshire. There's a story about his death at Kirklees. There's a story about his enmity with the Sheriff of Nottingham. There's a story about him fleeing the Sheriff to a knight in Lancashire. And there's a story about Little John and a cook that could be anywhere but is placed in Nottingham. And the author of the Gest is very good at bringing them together and self-consciously links them and explains, oh, and then the knight lent Little John and his services to the Sheriff of Nottingham, and then he came back to Barnesdale, and he or she has worked really hard to put them all together. But you can't quite hide the fact that these are very clearly separate oral tales put together into one relatively epic poem. Because of that, and because of the nature of the source material, a lot of scholars think Robin Hood is actually entirely fictional, and there is no real Robin Hood to find. He is simply a fictional character. That I'm not convinced by either. The oral tradition surrounding Robin Hood appears somewhere in the 13th century, and I think it is most likely inspired by someone. I suppose somebody could have made up a story and then it took root, but generally speaking, for this kind of oral tradition to take root, there's something beginning it. There's also almost no magic in it, so it doesn't seem connected to folklore around myth and magic and fairy folk and all these other kind of elements of British folklore. The story of Robin Hood is very practical. There's one mysterious woman who appears in Robin Hood, His Death, who might be a death omen relating to Celtic folklore, but other than that, and even that isn't very clear, she could just be a woman. Other than that, it's very rooted in reality, or at least in not the supernatural. And that suggests to me that there is somebody real who has inspired it, or possibly more than one person. The earliest clear reference to Robin Hood, not an actual retelling of the story, but simply a mention that Robin Hood is a character that people know of, is much earlier than any of the poems we've been looking at. It dates back to 1377. William Langland's poem Piers Plowman has the character Sloth say, "I know rhymes of Robin Hood." So there was obviously an oral tradition telling stories of Robin Hood as early as 1377. And J.C. Holt suggests the evidence actually goes back much further even than that. Starting from about 1261 to 62, we start to see the appearance of a surname, Robin Hood, all one word. And Holt says this is very unusual. You would expect the surname Hood, Hod, you would expect Robert or Robin as a first name. You might even see Robert or Robin as a second name, but Robin Hood, all one word, as a surname suggests that they are referring to the stories of Robin Hood, because the structure of it as an English surname in that period doesn't make sense, really. We start seeing these surnames appear about 1261 and usually attached to outlaws. So Holt's suggesting that there is this figure, Robin Hood, in the folklore, stories being told about him, he is an outlaw. So people who are real life outlaws are taking on the surname Robin Hood, either doing so deliberately themselves, as sort of advertising who they are, or being given it when they get caught, or when people are talking about them, to link them to the folklore of Robin Hood. And if that goes back to the mid-13th century, about the 1260s, that actually suggests that the original Richard and John timeline that we're all familiar with might be more possible after all. Because for the oral tradition to have taken root, and these surnames are relatively spread around across different parts of the country, and especially in the southeast of England, which has no connection to the stories, that suggests that you would have to go back a good few decades to find the originator of the stories, or the source of the legend. Now that might of course fit Holt's own suggestion for the possible real Robin Hood, which was that outlaw Robert Hod, who was arrested in 1225. About 40 years would be enough time for a legend to start to grow and take root and oral stories to be transmitted. So that's very much possible, but if we assume that these stories have taken a while to be really spread around the country, then it certainly is reasonably an argument in favour of the 1190s date that we're all probably sort of hoping is really the one, because we're so used to that being the period of Robin Hood. Holt has also pointed out that the Nottingham-based stories in the Gest of Robin Hood have a lot of parallels in other medieval ballads and romances about other figures, most of whom are also inspired by real people, but then kind of come into folklore and get transmuted into folklore. The Barnsdale-based sections, he suggests, are unique, and the story of the knight and his debt to the abbey, that Robin helps him to evade the machinations of the evil abbey who are trying to take his money. This particular story, Holt says, doesn't have particularly strong parallels elsewhere, whereas the stories around the archery contests and the sheriff and the various Nottingham-based adventures follow much more common patterns. Again suggesting that if there is an original Robin Hood, if there is a real person who inspired the legend, and particularly if he somehow had some kind of interaction with a knight that inspired that story, that Barnsdale is the more likely location that he would have actually been from. So what is the solution? It seems likely to me that there are probably at least two real Robin Hoods. Maybe only one of them actually called Robin Hood, or Robert Hod, or Robert whatever. But it looks to me like there's at least two traditions here, probably three if we're going to throw Lancashire in as well. You've got the Barnsdale-based Robin Hood and Little John. You've got the Sheriff of Nottingham, who has then been conflated with Robin Hood and Little John and associated with them. And some of the stories that these days are often told about Robin Hood and the Sheriff, sometimes it's Little John who's doing the action in some of the older stories, but Robin Hood and Little John are basically inseparable in the medieval sources anyway, or at least in terms of their activities, even if they're physically separated, they come together as a pair. But it does seem quite likely that there's an outlaw in Sherwood, there's an outlaw in Barnsdale, and then the stories of both have been conflated together. And maybe even a third in Lancashire. The one in Barnsdale might have been the origin of the name, but it's really hard to tell. One or both may have lived during the reigns of Richard and John. If there are two, then maybe Robert Hod is the source of the name. And there was another one in Sherwood, and those are the two that have come together to create the tradition. I think the reference to Edward as the king is probably later. I think that's way too late. If we've got the surname Robin Hood turning up from the 1260s, I think we have to assume that he predates any king called Edward. He's got to be from the reign of John's son, Henry III, or John, or Richard. But exactly which one, we really just can't know for sure. And it's thanks to the anonymous author of The Gest of Robin Hood, who has done so much work bringing these stories together to make them into a coherent whole, that we have the Robin Hood that we know and love today. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? Is Robin Hood from Yorkshire? Is he from Nottingham? Did he live during the reign of Richard or John or Henry? Is he from Lancashire? Is he a supporter of Simon de Montfort, or is he completely fictional? I want to know what you think. There are no right or wrong or definitive answers to this question. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye! Good girl. Good girl. Good girl.